It was February 14th when the first of the roses arrived. Sarah Mitchell had always loved Valentine's Day, the sweet aroma of fresh flowers, the twinkling of lights in every shop window, the excitement of lovers exchanging heartfelt notes. It was the one day of the year that seemed to promise love, affection, and warmth, a stark contrast to the cold of the season. But this year was different. This year, something in the air felt wrong. It all began with the delivery, a single rose, its red petals vibrant, its stem green and strong. The note attached was simple. For Sarah, with all my love, from an old admirer. The handwriting was familiar yet strange. It didn't belong to anyone Sarah could place, but the script was elegant, almost delicate, as though written by someone who knew her well. The rose itself was perfect, flawless, too perfect. A deep red that seemed to glow unnaturally in the dim light of her apartment. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she stared at it, wondering who could have sent it. At first, she dismissed the thought. After all, Valentine's Day was a day for surprises. She set the rose on the counter, deciding it was just a harmless gesture from a secret admirer. But then, the second one arrived. This time, the rose was accompanied by a different note. The curse of the rose will find you, Sarah. The price for your love is steep. The words sent a chill through Sarah, making her hands tremble as she held the note. The handwriting, now slightly more jagged, seemed to pulse with an intensity she couldn't explain. The rose, too, looked different, its edges curled slightly, as though it had been left out in the cold for far too long. She was about to discard the note when the doorbell rang again. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she rushed to the door. Standing on her doorstep was another delivery man, holding a bouquet of roses, this time, 5 of them, each one darker and more wilted than the last. The flowers appeared as though they were dying, and the smell of decay filled the air around her. Another delivery for Sarah Mitchell, the delivery man said, his voice flat, as if he were simply going through the motions. Sarah took the bouquet, her pulse quickening. Something wasn't right. She could feel it in her bones. As soon as the man left, she locked the door and rushed inside, her eyes scanning the bouquet for a note. The roses were indeed dying, their petals browning at the tips, yet their scent was overpowering, sharp, almost toxic. She turned over one of the flowers, revealing a small, handwritten tag hidden beneath the leaves. The curse is only beginning. You must stop it before it consumes you. The message sent an electric shock of fear through Sarah's veins. Her heart raced, her mind whirling. She didn't know who was sending these roses or why. But she felt a deep, gnawing sense that something terrible was happening, a dark force creeping into her life, a curse that was beginning to unravel. The phone rang. Sarah jumped, startled by the sudden noise. Her hands were shaking as she picked up the receiver, her breath caught in her throat. The voice on the other end was familiar, but she couldn't place it at first. Sarah, the voice whispered, barely audible, like the breath of someone standing just behind her. The roses are a warning. You've been chosen. The curse will take hold, and if you do not act, you will lose everything. Sarah's breath caught. She tried to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. The voice continued, its tone softer now, as though it were speaking from the shadows. You see, Sarah, it all began long ago, on a Valentine's Day just like this one. A promise was made, a promise of love, of devotion. But it was a love curse, bound by a pact made in the dark corners of the heart. And now, that curse has come for you. The phone line went dead. Sarah stood there, stunned, the receiver still pressed against her ear. Her mind raced to make sense of what she had just heard. A curse? A pact? It sounded like something out of a bad fairy tale, but there was no denying the fear that gripped her chest. The roses, the notes, the phone call, everything was connected, and it was all leading her somewhere she didn't want to go. The next morning, she decided to investigate. She gathered the roses, each one more decayed than the last, and began to search for answers. She combed through her old journals, her family's history, but found nothing that could explain the eerie messages and the curse that seemed to be closing in on her. It wasn't until she came across a dusty old book in the back of her closet that things began to make sense. The book, The Secrets of the Red Rose, was something she had inherited from her grandmother, a woman who had always spoken in cryptic phrases and whispered of dark magic. Sarah had never paid much attention to her grandmother's warnings, chalking them up to superstition and old age. But now, as she flipped through the pages, she found something that stopped her cold. There, among the faded pages, was the story of a curse, an ancient curse that revolved around the red rose. According to the book, the rose was a symbol of eternal love, but it was also a symbol of a binding pact made by a woman long ago. The pact had been sealed with blood, and it was a promise that could never be broken. The curse, however, was not just about love. It was about loss, the loss of everything precious. Those who received the curse roses were bound by the same pact, and they would experience a series of events that would strip away everything they held dear, until there was nothing left. And then, at the end of the curse, the final petal would fall. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The roses on her counter were wilting, the petals falling off one by one. It was happening. The curse was beginning, and she was its target. But the book also spoke of one thing, a way to break the curse. The only way to stop the roses from consuming her, the book said, was to return the roses to the person who had sent them. To confront the source of the curse and make amends for the promise made long ago. If she didn't act, the curse would only grow stronger, and the final petal would fall. It was then that Sarah realized, this wasn't just some random act of mischief. The roses had come from someone who knew her, someone who had been part of the past. Someone who had a dark connection to the curse. But who? As the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah stood by the window, looking out over the city. The fog had rolled in again, thicker now, and the air felt heavier. The roses on the table were almost completely dead now, their stems brittle and brown. The time was running out. She had to find the person behind it. She had to face the curse head-on, or lose everything. But little did she know, the truth of the curse was far darker than she could ever imagine, and the person behind it was someone much closer than she thought. Sarah couldn't sleep. The hours dragged by as she sat by the window, staring out into the thick, suffocating fog that blanketed the city. Her apartment had grown colder, the warmth of the day dissipating into the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. The roses on the counter were now little more than brown remnants of their former beauty, their petals scattered in the wind. But the curse, it was still alive. It was still there, whispering in the air, pushing her toward an unknown end. She had to act. The old book had given her a clue, return the roses to the person who had sent them. But that was easier said than done. Who could have known so much about her past? And why had they chosen now, of all times, to bring this curse to life? As the clock ticked toward midnight, Sarah finally stood up, determination setting into her bones. She grabbed her coat and left the apartment. There was one place she could go, one person who might hold the answers she desperately needed. It was time to confront the past. Time to confront the one person she had never wanted to see again. Her grandmother's house had always been a mystery to Sarah. The stories her grandmother told were too strange, too surreal to believe. But now, as Sarah drove through the foggy streets, heading toward the old, dilapidated house on the outskirts of town, the weight of the past seemed to press down on her shoulders. She remembered the warnings her grandmother had given her as a child, the cryptic advice, the hints about a curse that ran through their family's bloodline. "Never accept the rose, Sarah," her grandmother had always said. "It's not a gift. It's a trap." She pulled up to the house, its silhouette barely visible through the mist. The windows were dark, the door creaking as she stepped inside. The familiar smell of lavender and old wood filled the air. The house was exactly as she remembered it, empty, silent, as though it had been waiting for her return. The old wooden floors groaned under her weight as she moved through the house, following the path that led to the basement. Sarah had never been down there, not as a child. Her grandmother had always kept it locked, always warned her to stay away. But now, it seemed the only way forward was through the darkness. With a trembling hand, she opened the basement door. The smell of damp earth and stale air hit her immediately. The basement was cold and dim, with only a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with jars of herbs, old books, and strange trinkets. But in the center of the room, sitting on a small table, was a large, ornate box. The surface was carved with intricate patterns that reminded her of the symbol from the roses. Her heart raced as she approached the box, the weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on her. She opened it slowly, her breath catching in her throat as she peered inside. The box was filled with dozens of roses, red roses, their petals still fresh and vibrant, as though they had been picked just hours ago. And there, resting in the center of the roses, was a note. It was the same handwriting from the cards that had accompanied the roses she had received. The same message. The curse is inevitable. The price of love is steep. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind. Never accept the rose, Sarah. It's not a gift. It's a trap. Sarah felt a cold chill seep into her bones. The curse had come from here, from this very house. Her grandmother's warnings hadn't been superstition. They were a warning, a final plea to protect her family from the dark force that had been haunting them for generations. She had no time to waste. The roses, the curse, they were all tied together, tied to the pact that had been made long ago. But what was the pact? Who had made it? And why had it fallen to Sarah to break it? Suddenly, a voice broke through the silence, sending a shock of fear through her. You shouldn't have come back, Sarah. Sarah whirled around, her heart stopping in her chest. Standing in the doorway was her grandmother, but something was wrong. Her once vibrant eyes were now clouded with a strange, unnatural light. Her once warm presence now felt cold, distant, and malevolent. You're too late, her grandmother whispered. The curse is already upon you. Sarah took a step back, her mind reeling. What do you mean? What curse? Her grandmother's lips curled into a smile that was anything but comforting. The roses. The blood. The promise made so long ago. It was never supposed to be you, Sarah. You weren't supposed to be the one to inherit this curse. The room grew colder still, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch, growing darker and more menacing. The light from the bulb flickered as Sarah took another step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the box of roses on the table. She needed to do something, anything to stop this. I don't understand, she gasped, her voice breaking. Why me? Why now? Her grandmother's eyes narrowed, and the darkness around her seemed to pulse, as though it was alive. You are the last in the bloodline, Sarah. The curse was passed down through the generations, from one to the next. And now, it's your turn to carry it. But you don't have to. You can end it if you know how. Sarah's heart raced as she looked at the roses, at the symbol on the box, at the faded words her grandmother had once spoken. How? She whispered. Tell me how. The shadows seemed to press in on her, closing around her like a vice. Destroy the roses, her grandmother whispered, her voice fading into the darkness. Destroy the source. You can't break the curse, but you can end it for good. Or you can let it consume you. The choice is yours. Before Sarah could react, the ground beneath her feet trembled, the house creaking as if something deep within it had awakened. The roses on the table began to wilt, their petals falling off one by one. The smell of decay filled the air, and the shadows in the room seemed to come to life, swirling around her in a frenzy. The phone rang again. It was the same number. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for it, her breath catching in her throat. Sarah, the voice whispered, but this time, it was different. It was Victor Klein's voice, the voice of the dead man who had started all of this. You've opened the door. Now you must close it. The line went dead. The roses on the table fell apart completely, their petals turning to dust. And then, the house fell silent,